Hello guys, I'm going to go over the basics of lighting in 3ds Max. We've been talking a lot about lighting, how it enhances your scene, how it really gives the overall environment a realistic feel. And of course, since we're working in a 3D program, it's excellent to have your scenes render as realistically as possible. So as we know, we go to the Create tab, we go over here to Lights, and you see that Photometric is the default drop-down. We also have standard lighting. Now there's a big difference between these two. Generally, a lot of animators are working with the material editor here, but they're working with materials that are from the Autodesk material library, which render most effectively with the mental ray or eye ray renderer. If you render a scene and it has a line that just goes up and down, that means you're using the scan line renderer, and most of the time it's not going to render your images with the materials that you want, or at least how you want them to look. So you want to make sure you're on the mental ray renderer. And photometric lights work best with objects that are realistic. Photometric means that you're taking these true coordinates, this true material that have been generated in these materials, and you're making them cast shadows and work with the exterior lighting and how those shadows are cast. So that's where it works most effectively. In order for photometric lights to work, you really need to have your scene true to size. So if you have a house that is, let's say, 2 feet by 2 feet, and you put in a photometric light, you might have your entire scene blown out and it'll be entirely white. Versus if you had 8-foot walls and an 11 by 18-foot room, your photometric lights are going to work a lot more effectively. So if you plan on using photometric lights, it's going to be much more effective to include blocking, or consider blocking when you begin creating your scene, which is figuring out where the shadows are going to be cast, where is the light going to be hitting from, is it going to be coming in through the windows, etc., etc. A lot of times we don't want to mix photometric and standard lights, just because if we're using all mental ray materials from the Autodesk library, you want to have those shadows cast and the specular highlights as realistic as possible. So by introducing standard lights into the mix, you're not going to get the same effects. So if you are in the middle of your project and you haven't thought about lighting yet, then it might be smart to just mess around with standard lighting, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to show you a couple of different ones here, specifically the Omni Light and the Target Spotlight, which are going to be used most frequently. If you see in the photometric lights, you have similar ones. Target lights, free lights, and sky portals, MR's mental ray, 4D materials. So if we go down to an Omni Light, you can just place one in your viewport. If you notice, if I go to all 4 of my screens here, if I place a light, it just kind of hovers right here in the middle of a scene. So what I can do instead is I can raise this up a little bit. And I like to do this in my front viewport. It gives me a nice frame of reference here. And if I go to my perspective viewport and render this out, we're going to see the effect that our Omni Light has. Now sometimes our lights don't cast shadows right away, so let's go to the Modify tab with our Omni Light selected, of course. And you'll see that shadows are on in this case. If they are off, we render it. But let's make sure we're in my perspective viewport here. If they're off and I render it, you're going to have some pretty unrealistic lighting. Though there's highlights and a nice specular color on one side, it's not casting a shadow, which again leads to this more cartoon-like atmosphere, which is what we want to try and stay away from. So let's go ahead and keep shadows on. You have a couple different shadow options here. You have shadow mapping, area shadows, mental ray, shadow map, advanced ray traced shadows. Ray traced shadows pretty much is saying that the light is picking up on whatever object is in front of it, and the shadow is being cast based off of the object that the light is hitting. So again, that's default as well, so you can just keep that as is. So let's keep on making our way down the list here. Under intensity, color, and attenuation, which is a big word that we'll get to in a minute, the multiplier adjusts the strength of the light. So default is set to 1, but let's see what it looks like when I put it down to 0.2. Sorry, let's get my perspective viewport again. You're going to see that the light is much more dim. It's creating a more grayish atmosphere on my surface plane, yet it's still casting a shadow. So let's try the other end of that. And let's say we want the multiplier to be 5. You're going to see quite the opposite here, and we're going to get this really, really bright, high contrast image. So the nice part about these lights is you are able to change the color. Let's say I wanted a nice purple hue to go with my purple teapot. And let's maybe bump this down to something more like 2. Oh, sorry. You're going to see I have a nice colored light to go with my colored teapot. These are really easy ways to add some pizzazz to your scene. Also make it look a little bit more environmentally friendly, whatever you might be trying to achieve. Alright, so let's go look at attenuation here. This is pretty much an area that nobody ever quite looks at. So let's create a new target spotlight so it's easiest for us to see. So I'm in my top viewport here. I have my target, which we can edit. Put it up here towards the handle, and then let's take my actual target spot and adjust this a little bit up here. Alright. I'm going to get rid of my save frames here, so you can see a little bit more of my plane. Alright, so if I were to render this, we have 2 lights coming from 2 different ways. We have our target spot that is casting this shadow, and my Omni, which is giving more of this orb light that's also casting this shadow. What you see here from the target spot is where the light is beginning and where it's ending. So we can actually adjust some of these parameters here. So under attenuation, we can say that, let's try this view here. And this isn't going to show up unless you click show. So if you see this blue area here, this is my near attenuation. This is pretty much saying where do you want the light to start and where do you want it to end. So if it starts closer to the bulb itself, you're going to have a larger shadow, you're going to have a larger light area. So what this is saying is that from this near attenuation, which is the blue, to the far attenuation, which is this orange color, there we go, the brown right there. Sorry. What this is saying is that from this blue to the orange, this is where the majority of the strength is of my light, and then it's going to start to fall off when I get to the brown. So we can adjust this fall off here. And let's see what the effects are of that. The attenuation is not going to show up in your render unless you say use. So let's go back to a view more like this. And now you can really see where attenuation is coming into play. We have a fall off over here that's not allowing us to cast much of a shadow. Our light is still starting in about the same place. You can see that we now have a larger light area. So you can play around with this and see what effects you like, what you dislike. Let's just mess around here a little bit. See what that does for us. Alright, so again, it's giving us more of an overall light instead of a spotlight with a shadow. So again, if we start looking at these spotlight parameters, which are only available in the target spotlight, you'll see you have a hot spot and beam, which is this inner blue gizmo here. And then you have the fall off field, which is pretty much saying how far do you want that light to extend. So if I have a smaller hotspot beam, it's going to direct that light exactly towards my object, but it's not going to have a lifespan that is very far, which is the fall off field. So again, you can change these to be either circular or rectangular. I'm just going to keep mine at circular. And let's turn off the attenuation for now, so you can see the effects of the hotspot and beam. So this is like a pretty distinct shadow. If I increase my decrease my hotspot, and let's say increase my fall off, see what the difference is here. You're going to see a similar shadow cast, but you're going to have a broader light spectrum. So those are the basics of using standard lights. At this point, since many of you haven't figured out the lighting in your scenes and the blocking from the get-go, I would recommend using standard lights and trying to add some drama and different moods to your scene that way. Remember, experiment with changing the color, changing the multipliers. Use multiple lights to cast shadows with different objects, and you should have great success.